Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our second installment of World Religions via the village of 100 people, as if we took the 9 billion people on the planet now and shrunk them down to the accurate percentage of religious and faithful and where they say their prayers and their relationships with their spiritual world. And today we're moving, still within the Christian culture, we're moving to the East, to the Eastern Orthodox, and one of the most celebrated churches from that era is St. Basil's in Moscow, which is probably one of the key symbols of Russian architecture, right there next to the Kremlin in downtown Moscow. So we're going to work from the same type of principles of just black and white with our black color pencil to get our range of value as we move along in this course on drawing architecture. And we're going to talk about this Eastern Orthodox Church, which is really a collection of 14 self-governing churches united theologically without a central institutional structure. So Orthodox Christians believe their churches are an unbroken link back to the first church founded by St. Paul and represents the original expression of Christian doctrine as was developed in the Eastern Mediterranean. So in the Middle Ages, there was a split in the Christian church, East and West. And so we see the associate Byzantine Empire from that split from the Roman Catholic Church for doctrinal and then political reasons as well. So we see an image of St. Basil's on the square there, and we see a model of it over here. And so we're going to draw it from this view of entering from the northern porch. So if we tilt this up, we'll be able to see what happens in a small photograph of over here on the right. So it's access point over here. We'll see a little bit of the right side here, but again, you can see that there's a whole series of boxes that are all stacked up here with the Eastern Orthodox onion dome, sort of the crenellation on the top of it. So it really looks like a fire set up toward the heavens as you walk around. But the plan type is really sort of unusual in that it's sort of a blend of Eastern and Western ideas. And so there's some historians that think about the influence of the Italian Renaissance on Russian culture at that time. And we'll get to more of that in a little bit here. So it basically, as you can see in the model form, or we'll sketch over here on the right in plan form, the overall language of this is, like I mentioned before, held within a pure square, like many architecture is, rectangular or perfectly square. And so there's a initial relationship between that and the diagonal. So once you bisect the square, you find that midpoint to it. In this case, there are 8 chambers of ideas here that happen. So we'll keep bisecting it again. So in a sense, there's an octagon that makes it away with a chapel and a chapel and a chapel and a chapel. And then also on the diagonal as well, chapels that march around to individual saints. And they all focus then in this ring of chapels around the main one in the center, which has the largest spire in that plan type. And so that language of geometries is something that's shared amongst all cultures because even though the faiths may change, and we'll see some very disparate faiths as we move through the course here, geometries are fundamentally the same for everybody. Mathematics and geometry is global. It's a singular purpose there, so you can't have different geometries. You can have different applications of them, but obviously the core is common to all people. So with this, they think that maybe in the Italian Renaissance, there's Italian concepts from the 1450s moving on by, for instance, da Sangallo or Bramante, which are in the realm of what's happening here when the church is built by Ivan the Terrible in the 1500s. So the Cathedral of Vasily the Blessed, the most popular cultural symbol of Russia, it's now a museum because they had a communist overthrow in the 20th century, so they removed it from its cultural ties to religious structure. Although I believe in the 1990s, they allowed some performance of religious activities inside the cathedral. Its original name is Cathedral of the Intercession of the Most Holy Theotokos on the Moat, and built from 1555 to 1561, again from Ivan the Terrible. It was the city's tallest building until 1600s. It's a very large structure as well. The cathedral is made up of those 8 chapels, and the 10th chapel was added in 1588 off of this edge over here, an extension of that. And so it's kind of an odd aberration from the purity of the form up to it. And then our access point here we're going to draw from is to the north, which shows yet another cubic volume that projects out from the main mass. And then there's also a southern porch that kind of steps down from the main mass. And then along here is the moat edge for the palatial grounds. Again, as I mentioned, as part of state atheism, the church was impounded by the communists in the 20th century and completely secularized. It's a UNESCO site since 1990 and a very important building in Eastern Orthodox. So what we're going to do to step through the language of the form making of it, as I mentioned, we're going to look through the north portal here and get close to it. We'll establish our key aspects to all of our drawings, which is first the horizon line. So well down here on your paper that you've downloaded from the PDF, and I think some people will also simply just start the film, screen capture a still of this, and then print from that. That's another way to do it. But down here at the base, about 2 inches up from the line here, we could see hypothetically then how somebody here, since they're walking on the base of the building, their eyes are also on the horizon line. So that's what steps across here. So we'll have a little bit of the feet of the building coming beneath that. So for instance, an individual standing next to this, to give you some scale and size, is about that tall. So that sets up what has to govern the two vanishing points. And then we let the building itself then show us from that view shed as we look at this one box down here at the base very closely, the entry box here, which sort of sets up the foreground for the cathedral behind it, this north porch. Here is the top of that box, and you can see it is angling back to a left vanishing point way off the page here, kind of opposite to our prior sketch, which the left point was close and the right was further away. Depending on where the photograph's from or where you're seated on site, the points shift back and forth and kind of give you the approximation of where you're drawing from. But the right vanishing point for the box is almost a vertical line coming down and racing down here to the horizon line. So the right's on our page right here. And the left then is well off the page to the left. So whenever we draw lines that are vanishing to the left, we have to be wary of the idea that they're all coming down to a point over here off the paper. So even though they're parallel in space, never draw two horizontal lines actually parallel, because if you do that, you'll ruin the illusion of three-dimensionality. So in this case, we've got our presence of the perspective done on a two-dimensional piece of paper, and we need to have those exacting performance for our lines. So what that means then is coming down here, this base of the walls for our reception come down on both sides and create sort of feet for that. And they rise up to a certain point up here and then have a break mark between sort of the carrying element and what they're carrying up above. So we're subdividing this cube in the foreground here, which is our basis to set the whole sketch up. And then everything else relative to the size of the building is relative to that initial box we draw. Now, because in plan type, many of these internal volumes here are not just pure squares, but they're rather the relationship between the man-made, which is cubic and square-like, and then the sort of universal would be the circle inscribed in that. A lot of times religious cultures will do an interstitial volume rather than going directly from the square to the circle, and they'll use the chamfered edge of an octagon. So if we flattened out the circle 4 times, we've now created an 8-sided shape inside the square, which is the interstitial way of saying, moving from the man-made toward the heavens of the circle. The octagon is a nice architectural way to have that interstitial language. So in the plan type for this, all of the internal volumes here are octagonal. And so we'll see those rise up. You see in model form over here, these are square at the base, but these are all octagonal towers that rise up. What's nice about those, we can still find their perspective in space, but it's a little bit different than just drawing the perfect box straight up and then vanishing left and right. Because as it rises up, and we'll do a little diagram here, if it's an octagon, let's say, for instance, here is the top of a plane in perspective that's rising above us. And it's just a plane floating. It could be that flat, it could be broader. But again, if we bisect it, vanish back, and then find the octagon within that square, we now have 1, 2, 3, 4 sides of that octagon that we can draw in perspective in space. So we're going to use the squares as we march up to find the base of the octagon. Then we'll chamfer off the corners to do the volumes. So as we rise up now from the base, and we've got tick marks here to help you along the way, we're going to start left to right here because we've got our major box in the foreground completed. And then it rushes back to the side over here. At this point, stops and then comes down to grade. And from the front foot back to the horizon line, that's the back of that cubic volume. So just adjacent to it, there's connections between our entry level and then the main mass of the building. And those extend out till we come to the first base, the major tower over here. So that will rise up at this point. We'll keep going taller and taller in our foreground here. And then it'll stop at a certain point on the face of this, and then have its return on the other side. So the top of this is still flat because it's horizontal and it's parallel to all the other lines in space. These elements now are going to break down as they wrap around the other side of this octagon. We can extend those up. So you can see that the base of the cube is going up, and it's going to stay static and follow back to our left vanishing point. But now when we come to that change in direction, this is vanishing in perspective. This one rotates a degree of angle away from the actual line. That'll cut back in space and then sit on that space. We come to the next one, it happens as well up above it. And go like there. So now they're not vanishing to the same vanishing point here. They're coming to a secondary point that all the chamfered edges of the octagon vanish to. It still comes down to our horizon line, but it's a different set of points because it's shifting in plan away from what the box is doing. So we have vanishing points for all of our horizontals here. And we have another set of vanishing points for all the diagonals that connect in the octagonal. And since this is a complex of octagonal shapes, we have to do that over and over again per each volume. What helps us is that each volume is actually inscribed in a square face, a square face, a square face, a square face. So we draw that part first and then complete the rest as we move along. So there's the square face of this tower. When we come to the element up top here, we have the square of that tower in the center. And then it comes down to its secondary vanishing point line. And then the whole top of the main central piece and plan type, the center largest type of chapel inside of that, is then the most dedicated on the exterior skin with a very conical type of rise. So it's octagonal, but it keeps coming sort of floral up to one point at the very top. So from our square base here, and then moving back to an octagonal on its other side, we're simply going to go and create a pyramidal type hat on top of it. And then it's crowned with a little jewel of one more little onion dome at the top. And the onion domes can be sort of started as a pure circle, if you like. And then they sit down and they're a bit oblong at the base as they sort of are crowning each shaft or vertical that's moving up. I'm gonna do the same over on this side. and they don't really complete the circle beneath it, and they also sort of seem like they're pushed down a bit. So if you had a pure circle, the onion dome is a little bit squatter and then has a flatter base to it. And they'll have their little finial on top of each one that we'll see too. So from our viewpoint, we'll see a series of them, but we won't see all 8 because you're only allowed, because of the foreground of the building is cutting off your view of the rest. We do see 1, 2, 3, and the central tower to it. So our third one is right behind our entry. So first we'll put in the pyramidal hat for the entry, which rises up to about here. And then the rotunda of the onion dome behind it from a 4th chapel inside actually obscures the central tower a little bit. And then we drop that down on either side. And that's kind of the shape of the whole massing that we'll see from our end over here. But now we have to sort of push some volume into it, because this is not just an opaque mass, it's actually as an entry chamber. So people are walking from the plinth of the actual footing of the church on the plaza. So all the way down here in front, we'll value out with the actual type of surface of that. And we'll run that back eventually. But now we want to push space into here, much like the cavernous entry to Rhodes Cathedral from before. We want to come in and show the inside of this pier, as we see the front side as well as the right side to it. And then as it comes up to the sort of projection of what it's supporting up above, there are a double arch aspect in there. We see very closely in the model to help span that space. And we'll see the underside of both of those arches. And this comes down to a little pendant. Now pushing back is the movement of the stair, which starts at the base of these 2 massive sort of feet. And it goes up on a diagonal. So again, that stair isn't, if it was a flat access into at grade ecclesiastical space, this would just project back to our horizon line. Because it's rising up in space, it's going to be another diagonal that doesn't vanish to our existing points. So we'll simply take this rise up, and now the top of the tread does vanish to the left point, and the rise up again, and it does vanish to the left point, and then rise up again. And now at this point, it's going to vanish down to that left point because it's above the horizon line. So very quickly, the angle of the stair, whenever you do it in perspective, never vanishes to your actual points for the building, but all the treads do, because those are horizontal lines that are parallel. So the top tread for all these movement here, we can simply stroke in some stair treads as we move along here on both sides to get an idea of movement of space of having people rise up. Then when they come up, we see if this point is carried down, there's a series of piers that help define the length of the space. Because in floor plan, I mentioned before, this is pulled away from the building. So we have to go from our foreground view shed into this sort of chamber, which leads you to the first chapel on the inside. So at a certain point inside here, we see a secondary pier, and then finally a third pier in the back. And at the top of all those piers, it's taking us back in perspective to the left side. So we get sort of a tunnel view now, taking us from the plaza into a chamber, and then finally raising us up, like most ecclesiastical spaces do, from the terrain of man to the sacred up above that plane. So again, we're trying to bring the notion of the heavenly spirits down to the sacred on earth. Okay, so that's just sort of the bracketing out of the building. Over on this side, we could show more of what's happening that's crenellating around the side of this piece. And it breaks into different aspects of detail, and we'll add that after we put the value in. And then we'd actually see another bit of the church over here, but as it happens, in this, the way it's landscaped and dedicated here, there's a very large growth of trees on this side, and we're going to use that as a frame of reference to give a way to create information over on this side, where it steps down to the city more on the plaza, and over here where there's some growth of some mature trees. So rather than actually do a certain type, we'll abstract that and say, over on this side, we're just going to have the foliage of trees crop drawing off. And so that'll rise up to a certain height. Again, the shape is sort of a ball with the edge of tree leaves around it. And that'll come down to about this height above the horizon line, because we want it to float above the people walking underneath it. So if we drew more people over on this side walking around the base of it, they walk under this tree, and then we'll show the stem of the tree, the trunk coming down, and then maybe a secondary tree in the backdrop. And that'll help kind of terminate how much we can look at in our view shed over in this direction. So now our point in the reference here is to come back and detail some of the idea of making sure that our main three aspects here are moving in space. And so we've got the box-like front of all the onion dome towers here, then the two chamfered edges, which go back to different vanishing points on both sides. So this one is parallel to this one. That one is parallel to that one. So they're going to go to the same point here. Those two are going to the same point there. So even if it's angular, if they're parallel in the same angle, they're going to be driven down to the horizon line to another set of points. So that's where you shift the idea that 2 points dominate, because now 2 points will dominate for the orthogonal and 2 points will dominate for the diagonal that are in the construction here. So now what we can do is simply start to articulate some of our values. We kind of move through the sort of coding of light on the space to help this perform in terms of its detailing. And we're fortunate because if this is the northern face, this gets western light on this side of the building. So we're going to have that western light really project off and really hold a lot of light on the western face over here and less on the northern face. So we're going to give tone to all the value that's facing us, and then keep a white aspect to the areas that are over to the right. So it's just a quick, clean 30% wash on all these aspects that face us, and keep the highlights on the right side of the cubic volume. And now because we've got this projecting out closer to us, it's actually going to cast a shadow where this normally would have received light over here. So coming down an angle piece over there, this will eventually become darker as a shadow, but we'll simply gray it out for now to that point. And now finally the base of the tower over here will also get, here's a gradation. The tree itself is always going to be darker when it's in full bloom here as a nice strong value next to us. So I'll give it its base tone now. And we're going to give it more information as we detail it out adjacent to the structure. So it's got a profile that overlaps this, but we're going to fade it out towards the edge of the page. Never detail anything right towards page edge, because you're visually, you're competing with the idea of you're trying to construct something three-dimensionally here. When you come to the edge of the paper, we're reminded it's only a two-dimensional object you're drawing it on. So it competes. So you tend to want to float this away from the actual edge of your media here, the paper stock. So we've got our foreground with the people in front. We can even drop a couple people a little bit larger in scale and closer to us, because it's a very popular, very visited site, as you can imagine, near the Kremlin there in downtown Moscow. So we'll perform with a crowd of tourists there. And then we want to show the shaping of these onion domes, and just like any type of globe would be, it's going to be valued on, we do a little sketch up here, it's going to be valued on one side that doesn't receive light, and it kind of fades away in kind of an arc. So you never want to do a line on a volume. You want to have it push along kind of around, almost hyperbolic movement. So the sun comes down, has a hot spot on one side of it, and then feathers off to the other edge. So we're going to come again to that north and eastern side of here, away from the sun. And we'll keep on adding layers as we move along, but that'll give more shape and volume to be this sort of cylindrical or volumetric spherical type of onion domes. And then, of course, when we move into our chamber here, there's light coming in periodically through the cubic entry system over here, but we're going deeper and deeper into the space as we rise up with that last bit. And so right at this last little level, we're actually looking in the interior of that one chapel. So this area is going to go fairly dark for us to take us up that stair. And that's how we're using our ability of value to push people from something that seems close to us back into the actual depth of the piece of paper. So just by perspectival value, we've created distance on something, again, that's paper thin. So we're going to keep moving now through the value inside here, because the rest of it gets really secondary light to it. There'll be a little bit on the pier that holds up these columns, but then behind it, this is all valued out. And we'll start with the base tone, leave a little bit of white in there, so it's got a little activity of light bouncing around, but the rest of the columns and piers beyond this first one all grayed out, taking us back toward that space. I think it's more vertical than first time I drew it through. And then we see the carriage of the beams that come across and support on its way. Get a little more thickness to the wall in the front here. And now what we'll do for its performance moving on, there is a little bit of information from this one we haven't drawn in yet. This necking for it comes over to the parallel for its octagon, and then finally returns back. And we see that tower coming down some more, and finally ending in the base behind our entry pavilion. So that's the far right edge wrapping around this part. You can see that octagon curling over on this point. You want to show a little of that, and that's in pure light there. So what we want to do is show something in the backdrop to save that light as we see the right side of this chasing away. So keeping that white and having that line really strong, we can then assume the vegetation then at this size, going back in scale, would be about that height. So we're going to go and just hint at vegetation in the distance on the backside of the complex as well. And that gray there will help the performance of finding an end for the sketch at that end. So we've got the sense of looking around, of moving towards it, moving up into it, and that way the human eye is kind of intrigued along there. So the ornamentation for here, apparently back when it was built, people speculated it was all white with golden domes. And then there was sort of a cultural shift about 200 years later where colors were added. So the original colors of white and gold got shifted to something much more inspired by this being from the book of Revelation that describes a heavenly city full of colors. So the black and white doesn't show it here, but when you simply look it up online, you'll see the spectacle of the range of rainbow colors here. So it just seems like a sort of glorified fire toward that book of Revelation that describes this space. So it's, again, trying to treat it as kind of a graphic intonation of Russian Orthodox religion in the form of architecture on the side. So that bonfire raising up to the side, it's really sort of strange. It astonishes by its unexpectedness compared to other things around it. Its complexity and dazzling, its interweaving, and this sort of final manifold of all the ideas and the presence of it makes it very, very theatrical. And so it's sort of a really great blend of the Russian language from their history of hundreds of years of wooden churches, finally brought down here to a heroic, sort of initially for the Tsar at the time, to the influence of the order and classicism coming from Italy as they sort of migrated up into that part of Asia. And so a lot of Italian craftsmen came here, and somebody influenced then the final design of this in terms of its sort of regular quality and plan type, which we'll see more of later on. The central core and the four larger churches are major axes or compass points. And so they create this sort of cuboid in plan, and yet it looks sort of random and theatrical in terms of mass on the outside because the towers are of different height and they're all detailed differently. So considering that detail, as they build up, for instance, on some of their language here, they'll add tiers of structural arches that will make their way up the church elevation. Lots of different details towards crenellation and activity in the mass and form. Some of the domes have got little patterns of detail projecting out from the dome proper, giving it some texture and space. And if we come close now, our goal now as we detail this out in the last 15 minutes or so is to make sure that we're concentrating on the parts of the cathedral that are closest to us. So we want to pull this box off by giving it the most attention to detail. As we step away layer by layer, it'll become more symptomatic and more diagrammatic. So at the base here, we've got heavy sort of feet that cascade out. So this sort of steps as it comes down to the ground on both sides. And then as it rises up, it also has blocks to it. So just above the horizon line, there's a block that then supports decorative marbling. And that supports twin columns, which rise up again planarly, but they rise up in these segments, which each one is holding up the one above it until finally we come to its entablature, which supports the arched arcade above it. And then that wraps, because we see this side, it wraps over to the inside too. And so we're starting to give some demonstration of that language. We can push that back. And at this point, the same thing happens with the next pier in. So we'll draw a little of it and find the next pier. It will dissipate it out, because the further away is, the less attention we see that detail. But because it's all parallel to each other, it follows the same horizon line back to that point over here on the right. And so that sort of animates that front. We come up above the two double arches up here, and then there is a continuing pier that comes up to the top, and then a slender arch just above the two we've already drawn. And finally to its own cornice line. So it's using some of the trappings of classical language from a bit more of Western culture, but it's blending it with the moves that Eastern culture had made through the years as well. We turn the corner, that comes back, and we see that cornice line come down to the back of the cube. And so that'll come down and drop. And now we can return the edges of these back to the right vanishing point. So just really briefly, just little tick marks of that going back. So we've got some information, because the sunlight will wash out our attention to detail there. Sometimes you can see more detail on the shade side, because the sun has a way of sort of bleaching out information. Come back to the onion dome above it here. It's going to have a pattern where every time there's a change, there's a detail. And that'll step down the triptych of arches here, triptych over there. This rises up, a little bit of fenestration. And now over to the left side over here with the main dominant one sort of closest to our foreground. That comes up to a certain point beyond the base church itself and has a series of platforms which kind of keeps stepping up towards the throw of a vertical. And then each of those has a flattened arch. And this swoops up towards the support for the dome and something a little curvilinear. We drew them in a box originally, but it's really more sweeping up towards it and then creating a neck for the onion dome to chase around on both sides of it. So it's pinnacle. And so you start the expression here, and we've got enough attention to detail, I think, to go back into our last stage of value in organizing the skin here. We can come down and break this up closer to grade with some more information at the base. Once you see it through Pinterest or Google Images, you'll see scores and scores of secondary details here, and as time allows, you keep adding them. But at this point, we know we're talking about St. Basil. We know the language of it, sort of how it relates with East and Western ideas in terms of architectural planning. And so we're just trying to get more of a complete picture of this. And so what we're missing, if you look at our zone of value that goes from page white to the absolute black of what our media can give us, we need more of the 60 to 80% now to charge into this. So if I set this over here for a second, the deepest part will be on the edges that are receiving the least amount of light on these conical changes. So if it's shifting around, there's light side, there's shade side. Then there's a side that simply doesn't even face the direction it's on, it's the opposite side. So that becomes a darker gray than the shade side does here. The underside of these arches up into the ceiling is much darker. And as we look through this, the light will come periodically through the windows here to light the stair, and the stair reflects up, but the underside between the beams going back receives less light because by the time it bounces, it diminishes. So the top third of this space is actually much darker than the lower third as it lights the stairs coming back. And that'll give us a nice dark coming at the edge of our front pier here. Sorry to push that back. So now we can come to the opposite side. Here's our grayed out side to this turret. This side's receiving the least amount of light. So up to that point, that's the darkest edge, and it continues down there. Same is true for the main one, the main spire that has its pyramidal top to it. This last edge to it is the one that has got the least amount of light available. And this one as well. Over on this side, it's the darkest aspect to the tower that supports this onion dome. Now, because they're all different, this has got little patterns of projections that come out, and they're kind of striated along linear lines, almost like vegetation, coming down with line work and then going in the opposite direction. So it kind of gives a texture and a pattern to how they lay out there. And the one over here has got more bulbous aspects to the growth on the shape of it. And the one on this side has got simply bands that rise up from the base, almost like a turban. And then a secondary line adjacent to it. So the ones that are over on this side are going to receive less light as those turban type aspects kind of line that out. And it steps down and has that profile. And now as you kind of bring that language of the darks kind of coming across the whole asset, we push more to 60 and 70%, we can address the clump of vegetation we put over here in the trees and say that the light might hit this part of the tree strong at the top, but then the tree then casts a shadow on the undercarriage. And the contrast of the tree next to the building is the one we need to use so that the building ends up being a lighter material than the green leaf. So we're going to come and use the darkness at the very edge of the tree very strong, and have that dissipate out to the left, just to shape it and create sort of like a framework for the actual architecture to stop. I mean, the trunk comes down and has definition to it. And now in the backdrop behind, there's very little light going on this side, rotating around there. So we know that's a darker value at that edge. It'll come behind our people in the foreground. But then they'll see light coming by the building and light up something in the background. So we can just sort of quickly indicate that there is other types of parliamentary buildings in downtown Moscow here of a certain scale adjacent to it in the distance. And maybe those have a certain tone to them in the backdrop. And continue that over on this side of something coming up from the left vanishing point. There's some idea of mass, and not even informational, just sort of like a tone in space there. And now to let the people kind of stand in their way, because we're in line work, they're going to end up being not part of the sketch. So we give them a little bit of value in their torso. Then you can decide that some might have lighter colored pants. But the key here now is to take that light angle and just cast that shadow down for each one. So they end up being standing on that plaza or open space. So that sets them down in the space and makes them part of the composition. And now we're going to use some of our attributes of the sky to highlight the really great quality of these onion domes up here by taking, and this will bleed out some of our sketch work up here, but we'll start again on the left side. On the very edge of the pencil, you see how I'm almost parallel with the paper when I'm doing these strokes at a 45-degree angle, because the idea is the sky's got no lines in it. So you want to kind of just make it a wash somehow with the pencil. So eventually the strokes kind of disappear. And then we want to bleed that right through the towers up there until we get to this white part of it. So if that goes darker, it makes the white more pronounced. You take that all the way up to the white of the onion dome. And then that color of blue or a cloud or whatever it's happening up above here is going to be that piece that helps highlight the architecture. And that passes right through over here towards our diagrammatic things. It washes in there. And so that kind of gives some depth to the piece of paper beyond our subject matter. And now the projection of this, right now the grays are the same tone as the frontispiece here, but we know this is a certain depth around here, maybe 30, 40 feet. So we need to make sure that this piece casts a shadow onto our structure back here. So we're going to come back where we initially laid that out and go deeper right up to the edge of the structure of the front portal. And as we mentioned before, that shadow, when it's cast, we're going to draw it darker when it's next to a light, because even though it'll be the same tone as this, it'll appear darker to the human eye when they see that contrast. Once we draw it darker, this is going to appear whiter than the white of the paper we started with down there, because we're surrounding it. So this great fortress-style corbelled cornice of Western Church is the entry into Jerusalem here. And when you get an entry to Jerusalem, there's the impact of each faithful type of space, one of the 9 chapels, and there's 10 now at the extension to the north here. But during World War I, the Bolsheviks took over in 1918, just basically on a pretext of embezzling nationalized church properties. There was the entertainment of demolishing the church after Lenin's funeral. So this idea of reconstructing the whole capital from scratch and denying his history to it. Stalin, who had taken over from Lenin, basically he said, no, we've got to put that back and intact and restore this building, because at least he understood the importance of this, even though not used as an active church, how important it was as an icon of Russian culture. Okay, so the last steps now are to come back in first with our detail of line work to make sure we've got our promise of one of our key principles in shape, again, going back to just the cubic volume, that if a line does not hold volume behind it, if it's just on the surface of two things, it's a secondary line. If a line holds space behind it, so that basically you can lose the sight of the pencil behind here because there's a volume behind here we can't see, that's a more important line. So take one of your last sharpened pencils here. You might have one left. And take that to the edges. So when we look at the structure up here, we want to make sure we've got this edge to the left, coming down with its change of value over here. This onion dome is going to sit down. You draw it a little bit broader here, a little bit flatter. So it comes down and sits on this. Over here to the left edge, and now the tree covers up that. So now our dark edge, in terms of final line work, is critical that this is nice and bold and dark. To here. And then supporting that tree, the underside, because the tree casts a shadow on the tree trunk and it's darkest right where the least light comes in. As the tree trunk comes down to the ground, it becomes lightened up by light bouncing off the ground to the underside of the tree. So typically the darkest part is a little bit of black right at the base to really hold all the vegetation on top of it. Now we don't want to take the dark line over here because it draws our interest away from the subject matter and we're taunting the two-dimensionality of the paper over here. We see little bits and pieces of the edge of the church over here in the distance, and those are important too to make sure those are absolute black as well. And now we come to the top of our cube on both sides, and then running down the left side here where the north part casts a shadow in that zone. We could probably highlight the edge of some of the people in the foreground here. And now we saw before, right now our plaza is all fairly white, and so it's not really helping us too much. I think an important part would be come from the vanishing point and delineate something in terms of the idea of planes are going to cross here, whether they're paving patterns or something, gives it sort of a basis of rest and follows the two vanishing points. And those lines then help sit this down. And then from this corner going back, to sort of match the building, we're going to come in and throw a cast shadow fairly dark behind these people. And so that shadow will come up then and match this one around that corner. So we're saying it comes and fills in this gap as well as part of the front elevation there. And that'll sort of help sit down and push this back a bit. And now you can see how the front pavilion kind of rushes up towards us. And I think that probably does enough for value on this side of it to set this down. Maybe we come over on the other side and say the stone, the coloration of this, the vibrant colors would really be projected and go white for us to help that pronounce this is the sun side. So maybe the paving over here would be darker. So we can come to the base on this walkway over here and just take that down to a tone, which again traps our white within the range of grays over here. Maybe we can edge this pier a little bit as it returns and goes around the corner. Give it some substance. And then some of the volume we can do in terms of depth is the underside of the arch creates space. This first pier, it projects space before you get into it. And then going back within the actual depths of this, even though it's sort of a sketch of an idea for what's actually happening there. And then we could probably go even darker and darker within the black here. So we want absolute black, that would be the interior because that's receiving the least amount of light. And so the eye then again is going to go to that. When it sees a white page, it goes to the absolute black. That's the attraction. So you want to make sure you always have that maturity of line work inside that. These lines can be doubled up for the thickness of that decorative piece here. And then as time allows, you can kind of chip away at the attention to detail the whole way through. Every last surface here has got some really interesting ideas and architectural presence to it. So thank you for joining us today. The next step in our pathway through global religions is the third aspect of Christian faith, where they again split due to Martin Luther in about 1511 when he posted his theses on the cathedral at Worms and basically created the protestation of the Catholic faith, and the split happens between them, Protestants moving on versus the Catholic trend. So we'll go to a major piece of Protestant architecture in England in our next Draw Along lecture. See you then, pen before mouse. Goodbye.